Hello and welcome to the Kentucky Today podcast. I am Lawrence Smith, the editor of Kentucky Today. And alongside Chip Hutchison, our content editor for Kentucky Today, and special guest host, Tessa Redmond of Kentucky Today. Tessa, good to have you here today for Mark.
Yeah, thank you for letting me join. I'm excited.
Chip, we've been doing this a long time, but I think we would both agree that we've never seen a better young reporter than Tessa Redmond here. So we're glad that she is part of our group today.
Yes, amen to that.
She adds some class to the operation for sure.
She does.
Well, of course, we run hundreds of stories every week on Kentucky Today. And I want to start by asking each of you to talk about a story that caught your attention. What is your top story that you want to talk about this week that we ran on Kentucky Today? What got your attention and why? So let's start with Chip.
Well, there are two opinion pieces. One is by Todd Gray about giving and the encouraging pastors to lead their churches in promoting giving.
By the way, Todd Gray's our boss. We're not sucking up to him, but it was a good piece.
Sucking up. It's just, I have already made copies of that article to distribute at my church. So, but also one by Seth Carter, who's a pastor in Eastern Kentucky. It's a letter to the Governor Bashir about a comment he made recently referencing his Christian faith. I think you'll find that his article extremely helpful and informative to you. Then as far as a news article, the story about cooperative program giving in Kentucky, 2.5 million, I think, in January. Of course, a lot of that was monies that came into churches in December. Then $2.8 million given to the Lottie Moon Christmas offering. Of course, that goes to international missions. So for 5 months into this fiscal year, Kentucky Baptists have given more than $800,000 more than they did last year at this time. So that was an extremely encouraging article to me.
We are very grateful to Kentucky Baptists for their generous giving to the cooperative program. And yes, Seth's article on the Bashir comments, national comments he made in a couple of locations was very good. And that got a lot of national attention, what Bashir said, basically twisting scripture to fit his kind of pro-trans agenda. So I encourage you to go read that article by Seth Carter. Tessa, what about you? What stories caught your attention this week?
There were also two for me this week. The first was last week, the CDC released provisional data on births in 2025, and it confirmed what experts thought last year. So there were around 24,000 less births in 2025 than 2024. And of course, we saw a little bit of an uptick in 2024. And so the history behind that is birth rates have been slowly declining here in the US. And there's a little bit of a boom after COVID. And then in 2023, it bottomed out. It was the lowest yearly total we saw since 1979. There was an uptick in 2024, but experts were saying, we don't really think this is going to be a trend. And that has proven true. And I just think that's really interesting. One of the experts in the story said that economic factors play into choices around childbearing. But I just think it's interesting to consider why people are making choices. You know, people are having children later in life, they're waiting, they're having less children. And what does that say about what we as a nation believe about childbearing and parenthood? I just think it's interesting. So I'd encourage y'all to take a look at that story. I just found it fascinating.
And of course, before you mention that is a crisis not just here, but around the world that right. could really come to roost in the near future. Mm-hmm. The declining birth rate that's less than the replacement rate.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it'll be interesting to see how trends continue, not just here in the U.S., but nationally and internationally. And speaking of international, one thing I thought was really interesting was, I believe it's Highview Baptist in Louisville. They are sending a couple to Thailand, a family to Thailand. There's a sending celebration in Arkansas last week, and I was just so touched by their story. That couple, they had spent, it had been 2 decades since they were in church, and the first church they visited was Highview. They surrendered their lives to the Lord, and now Highview is their sending church. And it's such an inspiration just to see lostness is just a global issue and it can feel completely overwhelming. But when you hear the stories about local believers who are just being faithful to do what God is calling them to do, even if it takes them to the other side of the globe, I just love to read about that. It's just such an encouragement to me.
Yeah, it's so grateful that Kentucky Baptists are generous not only in giving but also in going to fulfill the Great Commission. A couple of great stories, you're right. For me, it's one that signals kind of a shift in the LGBTQ revolution. The American Society of Plastic Surgeons recommending that its members delay what it calls gender reassignment surgery until patients reach age 19. In other words, none of these permanently disfiguring surgeries for minors. The society said in a statement, and I'm going to read part of this, that there was low certainty that the procedures brought a favorable risk-benefit rationale. You think? You know? Later, the American Medical Association also reversed course on transgender procedures for minors. Of course, all this comes as a detransitioner in New York won a $2 million lawsuit against her psychologist and her physician, saying they rushed her into this procedure. The jury agreed, and she got $2 million after having this disfiguring surgery, having her perfectly healthy female parts cut off. So there are more lawsuits like that in the pipeline, and whether it's for moral reasons or financial reasons, having these surgeries stopped is a good thing. So that's my story that caught my attention this week. We're also keeping an eye on, of course, what's going on at the legislature in Frankfurt, 2026 session. One bill that's been filed would make intentionally disrupting a worship service illegal in Kentucky, a crime. I talked to the sponsor of that bill, Representative Mitch Whitaker of Fleming Neon in Eastern Kentucky. First, explain exactly what your bill, House Bill 540, would do.
Well, House Bill 540 will create a new section of the Kentucky Revised Statutes to criminalize disrupting a religious service. It enhances the penalties that are on the books currently. If somebody were to protest in a church, there are a few laws that would apply, but none of them are quite right for the severity of the crime that's being committed. It also creates a civil penalty, which is brand new in the state of Kentucky, where people who have their right to worship infringed or churches themselves can sue civilly for monetary damages if their rights are infringed upon.
I want to break that down further in a moment, but first, there's already a federal law that makes it illegal to disrupt church services, the FACE Act, we know that. So why is a state law necessary?
Well, there's many different areas of law where we have state and federal laws that outlaw something. So this isn't something that's new. The reason why I wanted to make sure we had this in the state of Kentucky is I don't want us to have to rely on the federal prosecution system to enforce what we find in Kentucky to be egregious conduct. I want it to come down to the local prosecutors, local judges, and most importantly, local juries to decide whether this crime has been committed or not. We shouldn't have to rely on who's in the White House or what the political winds are to make sure that people are held accountable for a crime here in the state of Kentucky. So I've gotten that a lot, Lawrence, but I think this extra level of protection is good, even if the federal government does, enforce these actions like what we're seeing in the federal level right now with the protest in Minnesota. It's good to have that second level, because if there's some sort of a technicality where the offender gets off on one level, they can still be prosecuted on the other. So this is sort of a double layer of protection for our places of religious worship in the Commonwealth.
I assume, and you mentioned it, this was prompted by what happened in Minnesota.
Yes, it was. I watched that protest, and my skin is an inch thick, Lawrence. I'm in politics. There's not much that can really offend me. But when I saw these protesters getting in people's faces in a solemn place of worship, it really got under my skin to see, the first thought that came to mind was, what if this was my first time going to church in a long time? And this was what I was faced with when I tried to go to church. I saw the children and I thought, what if my son were in attendance and I had to explain what was going on to my son? And as the information has come out since the protest, we've seen just how egregious this was, especially for the children that endured the protest. So yeah, I hope that this sort of thing never happens in the state of Kentucky, Lawrence, but there's a chance that it will. And I think that this protest will probably embolden a lot of other bad actors to do protests like this in the future. And we need to plant our stake in the ground here in Kentucky and say we're not going to put up with it.
How would this bill add to state protections that are already in place, such as trespassing, harassment, laws like that?
I'm glad you asked. So currently there's 3 laws that I'm aware of that would apply if something like this occurred, and each one of them has some sort of a flaw. First, I'll start with trespass. In the state of Kentucky, this sort of trespass would be a trespass in the 3rd degree. So that means that it is the lowest of the trespass charges that we have on our books. The only way that a trespass applies is if the individual is told to leave and they don't leave. So in this instance, let's say a bunch of protesters come in, they start screaming, the pastor tells them to leave. He'd have to tell each one of them individually to leave or be able to do it loud enough to where they all hear. And if they then leave screaming on the way out, screaming in the faces of children on the way out, there's no trespass because they've left when they were told to leave. So there would be no consequence there. And even if they did stick around, trespass in the 3rd degree in the state of Kentucky is punishable by a violation, which is the same as jaywalking or running a red light. And I think that's just not severe enough for what we're facing. The other 2 laws we have are disorderly conduct and disruption of a meeting in the 2nd degree. And each one of those carry Class B misdemeanor charges. But I feel like our penalty should be stronger than a Class B misdemeanor for this egregious conduct. And Class B misdemeanor in the state of Kentucky is a $250 fine or up to 6 months in jail. Realistically, people are looking at the monetary penalty. So I want to bump that up. It should be more than $250 for infringing on somebody's right to worship. And also, I think we need to add an extra level of punishment to say this is different than protesting at a Walmart, for example. This is different than protesting at a Girl Scouts meeting. You know, this is a very solemn event that shouldn't be messed with by protesters. So this law will make it the most serious misdemeanor we have on the books, a Class A misdemeanor, punishable by a $500 penalty or up to 12 months in jail. Realistically, where I see this going is if somebody, was intent on disrupting a religious service, which that's an important thing I want to mention too, is that the intent must be there. If somebody is disruptive, but they don't have the intent to disrupt the meeting or to stop the meeting, then this law doesn't apply to them. But if they are nefarious bad actors that come in, I want to make sure that they have the strongest penalty they can under our misdemeanor law. And the $500 penalty is as high as we can go under our current laws. But that's why I also put in the civil cause of action to where you can be sued monetarily for much more than $500. What I've got in my current language, which bills are very fluid, would allow the attorney general to sue for up to $25,000 or individuals up to $10,000 or churches up to $10,000 or however much they've lost. So let's say that a church didn't collect their offering before the meeting was disturbed and their offering was going to be more than $10,000. They could collect what they were out. So I think this creates the best form of justice that we can under our current laws in Kentucky.
And just to clarify, and this would be an extreme case, for example, if there's something illegal going on in the name or guise of worship, that would not prevent authorities from coming in and interfering with that, right?
That's correct. Yeah. This is my intention of this law was to make sure that people who are just dead set on interfering with a religious service, disrupting that service, intimidating the people that are gathered there for worship are held accountable, and nobody else. We certainly don't want somebody being hauled off to jail for saying amen a little too loud in church. And that's not what this law does. I've had a lot of red herring issues thrown out there. Like, what if the pastor just doesn't understand the way the person's worshiping. That's why it's important to have this at a local level to where the prosecutor can say, no, this isn't actually someone that's intent on interfering with a religious service. This was someone, that was actually worshiping. And you have local juries that'll make this decision, and even the local police officers that respond. So this is narrowly tailored to where it only applies to serious bad actors.
So this will not apply to, as you mentioned, exuberance in worship.
No, certainly not. No, the intent has to be there to disrupt the meeting or to intimidate the people at that meeting. I certainly don't want to interfere with anybody's the way they express themselves in a place of worship.
So what kind of support are you receiving for this from your fellow legislators?
I'm receiving pretty good support from everybody I've talked to. The issue, Lawrence, is we've got a lot of bills that are being filed up here. So even the best of bills have a long uphill battle to getting passed. And that's what we're seeing. This bill hasn't been assigned to committee yet, but I expect it'll be referred to the Judiciary Committee, which is the busiest committee of all the committees. So I've still got a long way to go. I've got to get a lot of support and co-sponsors from other legislators. But overall, in my caucus, there has been pretty good support from everybody I've talked to. We take religion pretty seriously in the General Assembly, at least among the members of the majority.
That's where I was going next. I guess the big danger in a budget session like this is that it could get lost in the flurry of bills that are filed during this long session.
Yes, sir. Yeah, it definitely could. There's a ton of bills being filed, and there's a lot of, good bills that won't make it just because there's so much to handle. And we've only got 60 days constitutionally to pass these bills, and we're already over 20 days in. We've got a budget that we're going to have to pass, a $15 billion budget. You can imagine that eats up a lot of legislative capital up here in Frankfort. So it's important that Christians across the Commonwealth reach out to their legislators and tell them this is a priority for us. We can't wait, because if we put it off, we only come back in January. That leaves a long time for some of these bad actors to potentially come in, disrupt churches before we can come in and change it next year. So I think this is the time to pass the law. We just have to make it clear to every legislator that this is a priority. Our First Amendment rights are important, and that we should have the right to worship in the state of Kentucky.
That's Representative Mitch Whitaker, sponsor of House Bill 540. Chip, we've talked at length on this podcast about the church invasion in Minnesota. You're a longtime churchman, have served as a pastor. Do you think this kind of state version of the FACE Act would be helpful?
I think it would be. It is a sad commentary that we have to have, or we deem it necessary to have both the state and federal legislation, but certainly we want to protect churches and their right to worship freely. And so anything that can help to reach that goal, that's what we support. I think his bill is very thoughtful. I like the idea that it doesn't infringe on someone's worship if it's not exactly like you and I might worship. But I think it's a good action. I just find it unreal that 20 years ago, who would have ever thought we would need something like this? But I do like the fact that it's in place. I'm hopeful that churches would not have to face situations where this would come into play, because we do believe as Christians, we try to stay out of the legal arena as much as possible. But sometimes you have to do it to stand up, to be strong, according to Jude, to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. So yes, I'm supportive of this bill.
Tessa, your husband's a youth pastor. I guess it is a shame that this is among the things that you have to think about, security.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We're in more of a rural setting, ish. We're outside of Louisville, quite a bit. So security is, it is on the minds of our church members. And I know our safety team takes all of that very seriously. So it's sad that there's a need to consider legislation like this, but part of the role of government is to restrain and deter sinful human impulses. And so I think one of the good things about this bill is upping it to a Class A misdemeanor, like he was saying, and adding that civil component. Hopefully, so churches won't need to use that, but hopefully, if there are those who are tempted to infringe upon another First Amendment right, which is the freedom to practice our religion, they will be deterred from doing so.
Yeah, and Whitaker points out that this would not prevent protests on public streets or on the public sidewalk, peaceful protests outside a church, only disrupting a church service. So we'll keep an eye on that bill, among others. Well, Chip, the media's been all over this story of the apparent kidnapping of Savannah Guthrie, NBC News Today show host Savannah Guthrie's mother, Nancy. But there is also, you found out, a Kentucky connection.
There is, and it's one that even becomes a little bit personal for me. Nancy, her maiden name was Nancy Long. She and the man who she met became her husband, both born in Kentucky. She attended an all-girls school in northern Kentucky, then went to the University of Kentucky, where she served and worked on the student newspaper, the Kentucky Colonel. She was, and this dates that she was labeled the society editor of the Kentucky Colonel in 1963. Society editors now are called lifestyles editors. But it's interesting, in 1963, she was there. 4 years later, I was working on the staff of the Kentucky Colonel, but as a sports writer. And so I loved having that connection with her related to the University of Kentucky. I find it very interesting that she met the man who would become her husband on a blind date, and they met at a UK basketball game. So UK basketball, again, takes center stage.
Well, there have been no real breaks in this case. There's been some new evidence come out, but we certainly keep praying for Nancy Guthrie's safe return to her family.
Yes.
Another national story that could have a big impact, the trial in a lawsuit against the big social media companies. The plaintiff argues that these social media companies have intentionally made their platforms addicted to children, much like drugs and like casinos would be. Tessa, you can tell by all those board games behind you that you and your husband work with children a lot. Have you seen signs of this addiction to social media?
Oh, absolutely. Youth group every week, having to ask kids to get off phones, encouraging them to engage with people around them instead of scrolling, not just texting. They don't really have email, I don't think, but scrolling through social media. And even we had a youth event on Friday, and I had 5 girls here with some of our leaders, and had to ask them to get off their phones. Like, hey, if you're going to be here, be with each other. And so I think it's a big issue, and it impacts our youth. And, I think we have to remember that social media companies, they're built for profit, not for people. And the way that they make money is keeping people on their apps. Users make content, other users view that content, and advertisers pay to be a part of the conversation. And so by nature, these companies like Google and Meta, man, they need people engaged. And unfortunately, minors are being caught up in all of that.
Chip, you and I, of course, did not grow up with smartphones. We were kids way before that, but even now at our age, we can be caught kind of doom scrolling through social media.
Yeah, the alarming statistic that you see when you get your weekly screen time, and you think, my goodness, I could have used that time a whole lot more productively. And it is an eye opener. And frankly, for me, it has caused me to put down my phone sometimes. And I probably don't use it anywhere near as much as many of the people who are watching this podcast right now. But it is, and Tessa used the word, I think you did, addictive. And the idea that, hey, there's something on here I'm going to miss. The scary part is, and Lawrence, you and I mentioned this, you can say something just in conversation, and all of a sudden you'll get Facebook ads.
Yeah, that is kind of scary. Yeah.
Product.
Yeah.
So it is a little bit big brotherish. It does alarm me. And, we have a rule when we eat, we put down our phones. And any of our family that are with us, we don't have phones. At least that's one reprieve that we have from the social media frenzy.
Tessa, I'm curious, when you do kind of call out the young people on their social media use or being on their smartphones, how do they usually react to that?
They're generally pretty, receptive. And I think part of that comes from the relationships that we have with these kids, investing in their lives and caring about them. They know that we love them and we want what's best for them. And, when it's delivered in a gentle way, not condescending, right? But just coming to them with genuine concern. I mean, they're very receptive. They're great with all of that.
And of course, we should point out that many of the schools now are either banning or limiting screen time while the kids are in school. That's a good thing. All right. Well, the KBC has a big missions and evangelism event coming up next month called Reach. And Chip, you found someone who's been impacted by Reach on a couple of different levels.
Yes, Brian Horton, who is a church replanting strategist with us at KBC, has experienced Reach during his time as a pastor, during his time as an associational mission strategist in Eastern Kentucky, and now as a mission board staff member here. And he talks in the story that we published about how it impacted him during his time as a pastor, and especially in relationships with other pastors as they could bounce ideas off of each other. As an AMS, it was very helpful because he was responsible for helping a number of churches, not just the church where he is a member. And Reese gave him ideas, resources that allowed him to better do his job, but also to build the kingdom of God. And now, as working with KBC on the staff here, he has a role in creating the vision for what Reach will accomplish. So it's an evangelism and missions conference. It is not a conference just for pastors. Anybody, if you're a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, you can benefit. You can be encouraged. And I think you will be equipped to share your faith in ways that you probably might not imagine before you go to that conference. And that's March 9th and 10th at Westport Road Baptist Church here in Louisville.
And I'd encourage pastors and church leaders to register for that. As you mentioned, it's coming up early March. March 9th is when it starts, and it is here in the Louisville area at Westport Road Baptist Church. Well, before we close, a shout out once again to Kentucky Baptist Disaster Relief. It helped provide meals to snowstorm victims in Glasgow earlier this month, or last month, and also sent a crew to Jamaica to help rebuild after a hurricane hit there in the fall. So from one extreme, a snowstorm, to the tropics of Jamaica, our Kentucky Baptist Disaster Relief folks are on the job helping people and sharing the gospel. Well, thanks for watching and for listening. Please tell others about KentuckyToday.com and this podcast, and give us a 5-star review on Apple if you would. And for more on the Kentucky Baptist Convention and the cooperative program that makes this program possible, go to kybaptist.org. Lord willing, we'll see you next time on the Kentucky Today podcast.